This story was told to me by a stranger on a long train ride. He was sitting across from me in the quiet car, a thin, gray-haired man in his late 50s, with the kind of face that looks like it used to smile a lot, but had forgotten how. He stared out the window for the first 2 hours without saying a word, and then, somewhere around dusk, he turned to me and asked if he could tell me something. He said he needed to tell someone, and a stranger on a train seemed as good as anyone. What follows is his story, as close to his own words as my memory allows. He said he'd been a professor of English literature for most of his adult life, spent decades at a small college in upstate New York, tenure, published papers, the whole academic career. Never imagined he'd lose it all. He didn't want to bore me with the details of his downfall, he said. It was a sad story, and not a particularly interesting one. The short version was that he'd been pushed out of his department over some fabricated nonsense, academic politics, the kind of backstabbing that happens when budgets shrink and egos don't. After that, he'd tried teaching high school English for a while, then private tutoring. Neither worked out. He was too old, he said, to put up with the chaos of teenagers who didn't want to learn, and too proud to pretend he didn't mind. What he really needed was to get away. Far from the city, far from people, far from anything that reminded him of the life that had been taken from him. Money wasn't the issue. He'd saved well over the years. The problem was inside. His soul, he said. And he used that word. Soul was tearing itself apart day by day, spraying hot waves of grief and bitterness through his chest. He'd set goals for himself each morning and accomplish none of them by nightfall, then sink into guilt over his own uselessness, and in that guilt, grow even more paralyzed. A vicious circle with no exit. It was a neighbor back in the city who'd thrown him a lifeline. She said she knew someone who could get him work as a night watchman at an old farm out in the countryside. She connected him with a rough-looking man who ran a private security company. The kind of guy who looked like he'd been running shady operations since the 90s and hadn't updated his wardrobe or his ethics since. By the first week of October, they drove him out to his new post. The farm sat in the flat, open country west of the Adirondacks, on a stretch of land where the fields run for miles in every direction, and the tree line of a dense mixed forest marks the western boundary like a dark wall. The property itself was a cluster of old agricultural buildings, collapsing barns, rusted-out machine sheds, a row of concrete livestock shelters with caved-in roofs, all of it abandoned, all of it slowly being swallowed by weeds and weather. The farm hadn't been operational in 20 or 30 years. The only structures still in use were a couple of garages where equipment was stored. His post was the front gate, a chain-link checkpoint with a small guard shack next to it. The shack looked like a railroad car without wheels, long, narrow, metal-sided, with a cot, a space heater, a chemical toilet, and a television that got about 20 channels if the wind was right. The schedule was 24 hours on, 2 days off. A tractor came through around 4 in the afternoon. He'd open the gate, let it pass, close the gate. A combine showed up in the evening, same routine. Otherwise, nothing happened. Nothing at all. The previous watchman, he was told, had gone off somewhere. The boss said it casually, like the guy had simply quit. And the professor, his word, not mine, like an idiot, didn't think twice about it. He assumed gone off somewhere meant the man had gone on a bender and stopped showing up, not that he'd vanished. In hindsight, he should have asked more questions. The atmosphere on the farm was, in his words, crushingly bleak. On one side, the dark line of the forest. On the other 3, Nothing but harvested fields stretching to the horizon under a low, gray October sky. The kind of landscape that makes you feel like the last person on Earth. The kind of silence that has texture, thick and heavy, like wet wool pressed against your face. For the first few days, he stayed inside the guard shack. It had everything he needed, and the isolation felt almost comfortable. A cocoon of solitude after the noise and humiliation of his former life. But eventually the boredom dragged him outside. He started taking walks, first across the stubble fields surrounding the farm, 200 yards out, then back, carrying the battered double-barreled shotgun the security company had issued him. He'd sling it off his shoulder and pretend he was a hunter or a spy on a clandestine mission, or a soldier waiting for a helicopter extraction. Childish fantasies, he admitted, but they kept his mind occupied. He started exploring the farm itself a bit later. Something about it repelled him at first, a gut-level reluctance he couldn't explain. The crumbling livestock buildings and the old pigsties were saturated with a silence that felt wrong. Not empty, occupied. The abandoned administration building was the worst. Through the star-shaped holes in its shattered windows, a matte blackness stared out, and the doors, ripped from their hinges, leaning crookedly in their frames, seemed to beckon. Come in. Step into the dark. As if something ancient and patient was sitting inside, waiting to tell you a story about this place that you really didn't want to hear. But more than anything, he was drawn to the grain elevator. It was massive, a towering concrete structure covered in moss and lichen, with cracks running up its sides like veins. It was in terrible shape, clearly condemned, but there was something beautiful about it, he said. The way human industry and the indifference of nature had fused together, each one devouring the other. A monument to abandonment. If he hadn't found that beauty in the elevator, he said, none of the horror that followed would have happened. Because it was during one of his evening walks near it that he heard the sound. A dog. Barking. His skin prickled with goosebumps. His hands found the shotgun. He listened, trying to pinpoint the direction. The animal was behind the elevator. He moved toward the sound, stepping carefully, afraid that the crunch of dead leaves under his boots would spook the dog or provoke it. But when he rounded the elevator, there was no dog outside. What he found instead was a wooden barn with an iron door. That alone was strange, a heavy metal door on a wooden outbuilding. He grabbed the ridged metal handle and pulled. Locked. Then he looked more closely and noticed that every hinge had been sealed shut with welding beads. Someone had welded this door closed. Deliberately. He knocked on the door with the butt of his shotgun, and from inside, muffled, distant, resonating through the wood and metal, came a sound that made his blood go cold. A long, drawn-out cry, halfway between a bark and a moan, punctuated by rapid, heavy breathing. It sounded like an exhausted, starving dog that somehow possessed a human understanding of its own suffering. Not just an animal in pain, something that knew it was in pain and was asking, pleading, begging to be let out. He circled the building, looking for a crack between the boards, a gap wide enough to see through. But the old sun-bleached planks were pressed tight against each other, sealed shut by decades of swelling and drying. He couldn't see a thing. His heart clenched. The sound, that awful, pitiful, almost human bark, gnawed at his soul. He went back to the guard shack and called his boss. "There's a dog locked in the barn behind the elevator," he said. "No idea how it got in there." There was an irritated grunt on the other end of the line. Then a different voice came on, harder, colder, like someone who was used to giving orders and having them followed. "Listen. Your job is to sit at the gate. Stop wandering around the property. Don't interfere with things that don't concern you." Don't interfere with a trapped, suffering animal. A bitter lump of indignation lodged in his throat. He sat in the guard shack for the rest of the evening, stewing in helpless anger. And as night fell, the anger curdled into something worse. Fear. A deep, gnawing guilt. The feeling that by doing nothing, he'd committed a sin worse than if he'd put the miserable creature out of its suffering with a bullet. Sleep came poorly under the glow of the desk lamp. Without it, sleep didn't come at all. His rest was a half-conscious haze, scraps of thoughts tangling with fragments of dreams, projecting shadowy human figures onto the green walls of the shack. Every shape looked like someone standing in the corner, watching. And then, glass shattered. The sound split the silence like an axe. He jolted upright, barely staying conscious, nearly fainting as his feet hit the floor and crunched on broken glass. The window of the guard shack had been smashed inward. Shards glittered in the harsh light of the desk lamp, scattered across the floor like teeth. Still shaking, he grabbed the shotgun, pulled on his boots, and went outside. The property was lit by a single floodlight mounted on the roof of the shack, a cone of harsh white light that illuminated the immediate area but didn't reach the elevator or the barn. He started to go back inside for a flashlight, but as he crossed the threshold, something stopped him. On the ground, just outside the broken window, clearly visible in the mud, paw prints. Large ones, canine, but too big for any dog he'd ever seen. And they led away from the shack toward the barn. What he did next, he admitted, might sound reckless, but in the moment, fueled by fear and adrenaline and the animal instinct that takes over when rational thought shuts down, it felt like the only logical thing to do. He called his boss again, woke him up, told him, his voice cracking, that something deeply wrong was happening on the farm. There was an unexpected silence on the other end, and then the boss said, calmly, too calmly, that he was sending someone over. Stay in the shack, don't go anywhere. But staying put wasn't an option anymore. The emotions had taken control. He found a fire hook among the junk in the guard shack, a long metal pike with a curved blade at the end, threw on his coat, grabbed the shotgun and flashlight, and took a roundabout path through the junk pile toward the barn. He pried one board loose with the fire hook, then another, kicked them in, and through the hole he'd made in the wall, he aimed the flashlight beam into the darkness. The first thing he saw was a large hole in the ceiling, punched through from inside, the edges of the broken boards splintered outward. Something had torn its way out through the roof. Then he lowered the beam and saw the coffin. A zinc coffin, military style, sitting in the center of the barn floor. His insides turned to powder. His heart dissolved in his chest, leaving behind nothing but sick, arrhythmic pulses. He forced his numb legs to carry him inside. The wooden floor was layered with straw, the top layer slightly damp and rotting, the bottom dry and crackling with each step. In one corner, directly beneath the hole in the ceiling, a neat pile of pale, cracked bones had been stacked. The coffin was open, its lid, a bent zinc plate, lying on the bare floorboards a few feet away. His boot caught the edge of the lid. The metal plate rocked and produced a sound, a long, resonant, hollow moan that echoed through the barn. And he recognized it. It was the same sound he'd mistaken for a dog's bark. Everything inside him collapsed. He stumbled out of the barn, pressed his back against the nearest tree, and clutched his chest, trying to breathe. And as the rasp of his own breathing filled his ears, he remembered another detail. The first time he'd approached the barn and heard what he'd thought was a dog, there had also been the sound of rapid, heavy breathing, coming from inside. That breathing hadn't been a dog's. Whatever had been in that coffin, whatever had been sealed inside that barn with welded hinges and iron locks, had heard him, had breathed, had moaned through the zinc lid, producing that awful sound that he'd mistaken for a trapped animal's cry. And now, it had torn through the roof, climbed out into the night, and gone looking for the man who'd disturbed its rest. He stood motionless against the tree. Two voices argued inside his head. One screamed that he had to run. The other whimpered that he couldn't move, that if he made a single sound, the thing from the coffin would find him. And thinking about what would happen after that was worse than anything else. The unknown is always more terrifying than the visible monster. It's almost a relief when you can see the creature hunting you and failing to find you.
But until that moment, it could be anywhere, crouched behind the nearest wall, watching you from a dark corner with burning eyes, or hanging from the ceiling directly above you, studying the top of your head as the hair slowly turns white. He dropped the flashlight. He stood for several minutes, pressing the shotgun to his chest, not breathing. Then, through the silence, in which his own panicked breathing was louder than any scream, came the sound of an approaching vehicle, an engine, tires on gravel. Control returned to his frozen body. He ran, past the elevator, past the garages, straight toward the guard shack. He froze for one paralyzing second at the corner of a building, struck by the terrible thought. What if that's not a car? What if it's the thing, mimicking the sound of a...
"Hey!" a hoarse male voice shouted. "Where are you? Get over here!" His imagination was painting nightmares. The worst one was an indescribable monster that fed on fear and could reproduce any human voice with perfect accuracy. A thing calling out in the darkness, wearing a man's words like a costume. "Hey, it's me! Get in the car, now! Move it!" And then the voice yelped and choked and made a wet, gurgling sound, like someone drowning in their own throat. He braced the shotgun against his shoulder, clenched his teeth, stepped out from behind the building, and aimed at the moving figure near the guard shack. What he saw in those 5 seconds would stay with him forever. A human being is a strange creature. Sometimes it takes days to memorize a simple fact, and sometimes 5 seconds is all you need to burn a single image into your memory for eternity. He said that if he were a painter, he could reproduce what he saw with perfect accuracy. Massive, fleshy arms, thick as tree trunks, disappearing into the sleeves of what looked like a dark green military tunic, were tossing aside the headless body of a short, stocky man. In the floodlight, he could clearly see thick, knotted legs that bent backward at the knee, like a dog's hind legs. And the head. The creature's head was patchy, mottled, with a snout that jutted forward. When his grip weakened and the shotgun nearly slipped from his hands, the creature turned. He thanked every higher power he could think of that the floodlight beam didn't reach where he was standing. The light was apparently blinding the thing. It had just crawled out of a dark coffin into a world of artificial light, and its eyes hadn't adjusted. Its eyes. He said they looked like blisters filled with pus, swollen, bulging, wet, reflecting the floodlight in sickly yellow-white. A gaze that could freeze a person solid and then incinerate them. But those eyes, horrible as they were the least disturbing thing about its face. The face itself resembled the muzzle of some mutant dog, elongated, protruding, but covered in pale yellowish human skin that stretched and wrinkled in ways that skin should never move. The creature, apparently not seeing him, picked up the severed head from the ground, opened its jaws wide, and bit into it. The sound, the wet crunch, the tearing of tissue snapped him back to reality. He turned and ran. Climbing the fence and fleeing across the open fields was suicide. He'd be visible from a mile in any direction, and he'd run out of breath before he'd run out of danger. Going back to the guard shack meant passing the creature. He briefly considered trying to shoot it, but with only 2 shells and a pair of shaking hands, a miss would mean death.
An angry, wounded monster would tear him apart, the way it had torn apart the man the boss had sent. He decided to circle the farm along the fence, reach the tree line, and hide in the forest. But as he moved past the barn in the direction of the woods, something glass shattered nearby. A bottle, a window, something breaking against the frozen ground, and cold sweat erupted on his forehead. 1,000 voices whispered in his skull, "It's coming. It's right behind you." He ran faster, but at the edge of the forest, he hesitated. Navigating through dense trees and undergrowth in total darkness, without a flashlight, while being chased by a creature that apparently had a canine's sense of smell, that was a death sentence, not an escape plan. He veered left and sprinted toward the administration building instead. He crawled through a broken ground floor window and landed in a corridor whose floor was buried under decades of debris. Shattered drywall, rotted ceiling tiles, old newspapers, rusted filing cabinets. The floodlight from the guard shack lit the corridor through the broken windows in pale, slanting beams. He found the darkest corner, crouched behind a fallen cabinet, and leveled the shotgun at the doorway. The creature didn't take long. It passed the window several times, a massive, black silhouette sliding across the illuminated walls. Then he heard the crunch of footsteps on gravel and the wet slap of something dragging. He duck-walked to the nearest window and peered out, pressing himself flat against the wall. It was carrying the headless body, cradled in its arms like a grotesque infant, alternating between gnawing at the left side and the right, tearing strips of flesh with its teeth. The sight made something boil inside his stomach, a heat that spread through his body like scalding water. The thing ate with an enthusiasm that was almost joyful, and the sounds it made were the worst part. A low, rumbling animal growl mixed with, and this is exactly how he described it, a high, delighted human laugh, growling and giggling at the same time, while it ate. And then his phone rang, the tinny little ringtone, some default jingle he'd never bothered to change, cut through the night like a scream. In one motion, he ripped the phone from his pocket and hurled it to the floor, pulling back from the window. The creature snarled. The wet slaps of heavy paws hitting dirt matched the hammering of his heart. He was moving toward the door, unable to make himself run, his legs operating on some autopilot survival program, while his conscious mind went white with terror. Behind him, the thing smashed through the window and began tearing at the wooden partition between the panes, splintering the frame, ripping the wood apart, forcing its massive body through the gap. The sound of destruction filled the building, drowning everything else. He felt like he was wading through a swamp, each step an act of will against a body that had forgotten how to move. When he crawled through the doorway on the other side of the building, he was shaking so hard his teeth were chattering. He ducked around the corner and watched as the creature, half its body jammed through the broken window frame, its massive arms clawing at the walls, struggled to force itself through. He didn't shoot. He'd needed a clean headshot, and that chance was gone now. A hit to the body would only enrage it. He ran. The chase was less physically exhausting than mentally. Every step had to be consciously willed, because his terror-locked body wanted nothing more than to simply stop and accept whatever came next. But stopping meant dying, and somewhere beneath the fear, beneath the paralysis, the oldest part of his brain, the part that had kept his ancestors alive on the savannah 100,000 years ago, kept his legs moving. His last hope was the corpse near the guard shack. He prayed the creature would return to its meal before picking up his trail again. The sky was turning gray, the cold, colorless light of pre-dawn pressing down on him like a physical weight. Every gust of wind burned his throat. He threw himself into a refuse pit near the edge of the property, completely spent, gasping,
his heart hammering so hard he could feel it in his eyeballs. A small eternity passed. Then he heard footsteps. He peered over the edge of the pit. The creature was stalking through the property, carrying bones in its hands. Fresh bones, still covered in shreds of meat and tissue, which prevented it from bending fully to the ground to catch a scent. He waited until it disappeared behind a building, then slowly, inch by inch, burrowed under the reeking garbage bags until only his eyes were showing, praying that the stench would mask his trail. Dawn broke. When sunlight touched the top of the elevator, the creature suddenly stopped. It swayed like a drunk losing balance. He held his breath, squeezed the shotgun, ready to spring up and fire point blank into the dog-like muzzle. But the thing didn't come for him. It stood there, swaying, then turned and lumbered slowly on its backward bending legs toward the barn. It saw the hole he'd made in the wall, crawled inside, rattled the zinc plate, and went silent. What he did next, he told me, was the single stupidest thing he'd ever done in his life. He's cursed himself for it every day since. He cursed his fear and the insane idea his panicked brain had produced. But he was terrified, shaking, teeth chattering, bone-deep terrified, that when night fell again, the creature would come looking for him, and it would find him. It had a dog's nose on a monster's body, and now it knew his scent. He decided to kill it. Executing the plan turned out to be simpler than he'd expected. He waited, then crept to the barn and peered through the crack in the boards. Inside, in the grey light filtering through the hole in the ceiling, he could see the creature lying in the zinc coffin, the metal plate pulled over itself like a blanket. It was motionless, barely breathing. Whatever it was, sunlight seemed to weaken it, drain it, slow it down, push it into a state of torpor. He took off his boots so they wouldn't make noise, and step by step, barely disturbing the straw on the floor, he crept toward the coffin. Every wrong move could be his last. The sleeping creature radiated a cold like an open grave. Tears blurred his vision. Every cell of his exhausted body tensed for what he was about to do. He aimed the shotgun at the patch of scalp visible beneath the zinc plate, took a deep breath, and pulled the trigger. Click. A dry, hollow click that echoed through the dark corners of the barn. The gun didn't fire. He froze, his lungs locked. Sweat poured down his face. His hands shook so violently, the barrel rattled against the zinc. His feet felt like they'd grown roots into the straw and become part of the cursed barn. The creature pushed the zinc plate aside. It rose from the coffin. It looked at him, and the dog-like muzzle. He swore this to me, gripping the armrest of his train seat until his knuckles went white, stretched into a smile. A wide, slow, knowing smile that bared crooked, yellowish teeth. He jerked backward, but couldn't move. A scream solidified in his throat like cement. His face, he was sure, looked no better than the grinning abomination in front of him. The creature began to unfold its limbs, climbing out of the coffin, its horrible eyes, bloated, pus-filled, burning, never leaving his face. His thoughts scrambled. His own life seemed suddenly meaningless, distant, belonging to someone else. But somewhere deep inside, his subconscious was still fighting, sending one final signal on repeat. Run, run, run. And then, all at once, clarity crashed over him like cold water. He raised the shotgun and pulled the trigger again. Click. Another misfire. He swung the butt of the gun into the creature's face with everything he had, felt it connect with something that cracked and gave way, and bolted for the hole in the wall. On his way out, he dug a lighter from his coat pocket, and while the creature, weakened by daylight, barely able to drag its dog-like legs across the barn floor, struggled to follow, he touched the flame to the dry straw. It caught instantly. The fire raced across the floor, up the walls, consuming 30 years of accumulated dust and decay in seconds. His coat caught fire too. He tore it off and threw it behind him as he dove through the hole and sprinted for the fence. He cleared the fence in one vault, ran across the harvested fields without looking back, didn't stop until he reached a bus stop near a village he didn't recognize. Back in the city, he collapsed into bed and slept until late evening. When he woke, he drank and smoked half a pack of unfiltered cigarettes, and by the middle of the night, the unease had returned, worse than before, a crawling certainty that it wasn't over. He was sitting by the window when he heard a noise from the street below. He looked down into the courtyard, and there it was, the creature, charred, blackened, patches of burned skin peeling from its body, but alive, moving, skulking between the park benches and the dumpsters in the courtyard of his apartment building, sniffing the ground, searching. The fire hadn't killed it, it had only made it angry, and it had followed his scent across miles of open countryside, through villages, into the city, and straight to his building. That night, it tried to get into his stairwell. Something stopped it. He didn't know what. A locked door, maybe. The presence of other people. The security lights in the lobby. He watched from his window, barely breathing, as it paced back and forth, scratching at the entrance, its burned body steaming faintly in the cold night air. Before dawn, he saw it cross the courtyard and force open a boarded-up cellar door on the building across the street, looking for a dark place to sleep through the daylight hours. The next afternoon, when the courtyard was full of people, he called a taxi and went to the train station. When the man finished his story, there was a long silence between us. The train rocked gently on the tracks. Outside, the countryside was dark. "So," I said carefully, "you were carrying an empty gun that whole time?" "What?" He blinked, confused. "The two misfires. If the shotgun was issued to you by a security company and it misfired twice, it was probably never loaded in the first place. Nobody put shells in it." He stared at me. Something collapsed behind his eyes. Some last, small hope that there had been a barrier between him and the thing, however thin. The realization that he'd been holding a metal club the entire time, that there had never been anything between him and the creature but empty air and blind luck. At the next station, I got off. My traveling companion watched me go with an expression that I've thought about many times since. A look that was equal parts fear and bottomless sadness. The way a terminally ill patient looks at a doctor who has just confirmed the worst. What became of him after that, I don't know. He said the creature had an excellent sense of smell, and that having tracked him across open country to his city apartment, it would find him in any other city, in any other country. Maybe across an ocean, he said, he'd find peace. I never saw him again. But sometimes, late at night, when a train passes through the darkness outside my window, I think about the man in the quiet car and the thing that was following him. And I wonder, did he make it across the ocean? Or did it find him first?